So let us talk about the aorist tense. So now that we're on the aorist tense, we really are making some substantial progress. So well done for getting this far. The aorist tense is effectively the past tense in Greek. So it is incredibly important, and make sure that you really pay attention to this video. So it's a past tense, which means that it refers to an action that has been carried out in the past. But as I said before, this has to be a specific type of action, because recall when we were discussing the imperfect tense, that referred to a continuous action in the past. Okay? So let's say I was to say, when I was young, I always used to get up early. That's referring to a continuous action in the past. It wasn't just on one specific occasion. I was getting up early every single day when I was young. So that's an example of when you'd use the imperfect. But the aorist, okay, is used to refer to a single action in the past. So a sort of one-off, if you like. And to be honest, the majority of past tense instances will use the aorist. It is just slightly more common than the imperfect. So let's say I was to say, yesterday I ate a sandwich, that would go into the aorist. Yesterday I played football, that goes into the aorist. Because all of these are one-off actions, or rather they are single actions, and have been carried out in the past. So there are two types of aorists. You have the weak aorist, also known as the first aorist, and you have the strong aorist, which it would also called as the second aorist. Now, what's important to note is that there's actually no difference in the meaning. They both refer to a single action in the past, but they're only different in how they're formed. So the only difference is in formation. Okay, so that can be slightly confusing to understand. Basically, all verbs will either form a weak aorist or a strong aorist. So let's first describe the weak aorist. So the weak aorist involves obviously adding an augment, because it's a past tense. Adding an augment is one part of it. Adding a sigma is another. And then adding the endings. Like any tense, it has a set of endings, which are a, as, with the movable nu, amen, amen, ate, an. Okay, so let's take the example of pao, which forms a weak aorist rather than a strong aorist. So pao is our present stem. Now we add an augment because it's a past tense, so pao. Then we add a sigma, so paus. And then we add the ending. So let's say it was I stopped, then that's going to be pausa. Easy as that. Now one thing to note with the weak aorist is that, remember with the future, many verbs made spelling changes to incorporate that sigma into their stem. Well, the same is true of the weak aorist. You have labial and guttural stems. So for example, pempo, which as you'll recall has a labial stem, that will go to epempsa. Epempsa in the aorist. And with a psi, you see, to incorporate that sigma. That's the spelling change. So let's have a few examples then. So grapho. By the way, I'm only going to do the first person singular form here. So grapho will go to egrapsa in the weak aorist. Foulasso will go to ephulaxa. And patho, remember patho, it drops, remember patho, the theta drops out in the future to get peso. So in the weak aorist, it will go epesa. Again, the theta drops out. The spelling changes are exactly the same. Okay, so now let's talk about the strong aorist. So as I said before, the only difference is in formation and not in meaning. The strong aorist is irregular in that all the verbs will form different stems. And the only job we can do is learn them. But the good news is that many of these stems are predictable. So they're not regular, but they are predictable. So there's a key distinction there. And the endings are the same as the imperfect endings. So that's a bit of a blessing. And of course, it's a past tense, which means we need the augment. Okay, so let's take the example of lambano, which forms a strong aorist. So lambano is obviously I take, so I took would involve us putting this into the strong aorist. So lambano forms the stem lab. As you can see, it's definitely irregular, but it's predictable. So it's not completely different from the original present. I mean, it's basically a telescoping of this stem. So lamban has just been cut down to lab. And now what we need to do is add the augment, so lab, and then add the ending, so on. Or on as om and et on. You should remember those endings, they're the imperfect endings. So that's one example. Next, we have manthano. Manthano is, of course, I learn. Now, I learned would be mathon. So just like how lab is a shortened version of the present stem, math, well, is a shortened version of manthan. So it is predictable to an extent. However, there are some, I say to an extent, because there are some verbs that have completely outrageous stems. So for example, trecho, I run, has the stem dram. So it will go in the aorist edramon. Edramon, which is of course totally unpredictable and highly irregular. I'll give you just one more. Lepo is again quite nice in that it's predictable. This goes to elipon. So yes, you just have to learn them, but they are predictable, so they should not be too difficult to remember, although there are some, like trecho, that are highly irregular. So basically, when you look at a vocab list, when a verb is listed on that vocab list, it should give you the present, the future, the aorist, whether strong or weak, and the aorist passive, although we haven't looked at that yet, so don't worry about it. In fact, I'm not going to write it. So it will give you the present, the future, and the aorist. And so you just basically have to memorize the various stems. So let's have a game then when we have to, from a certain aorist, guess the stem. So, ago, okay, forms ergagon in the aorist. Now, what do you think is the stem of ergagon? So, first of all, we need to take off the ending. So, on gets chopped off, that's the ending. And now, what about the augment? The augment also needs to be chopped off, but there's no epsilon here. Instead, there's just an eta. So, what we can therefore assume is that the alpha has changed to an eta because of a clash between the alpha and the epsilon, which is the augment. So, when forming the strong aorist, imagine that there's almost an epsilon here, and that the epsilon and the alpha are merging to form eta. And obviously we have that epsilon because that's the augment. So, the stem of this will just be agag. That's going to be the stem. Agag.